Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Thursday, February 8th, 2018. The Dreamers are still held hostage, but signals indicate that the Democrats have agreed to a deal that will avert a government shutdown, produce a 2-year budget deal, and a promise from Democrats to disarm. No more threats of government shutdown. Now, let's take these one item at a time. As I'm speaking, it is 2:15 Pacific time on Thursday, and I just checked before I sat down behind the microphone. There has been no vote yet in the Senate, and the House vote won't occur until after the Senate votes. And the package is described as a beauty, depending on what your perspective is. From the point of view of Democrats and the left, the Republicans haven't laid a glove on big government programs. And they've extended the CHIP program even further than the last time. And there are lots of ornaments in this package that really do deliver on Democratic budget priorities. The price that's being paid is really, we can summarize it in two ways. One is that they have gone along with, and most of them don't oppose, a massive increase in the Pentagon budget. As I mentioned yesterday, this is budgeting for a war that Trump has not even tweeted us into yet. So the package there is a total of $300 billion. What I saw was $160 billion for the Pentagon and $140 billion for the rest of us. But that $160 billion, what is it for? Nobody is offering any rationale. Oh, we've heard Trump talk about the broken military. But it was Obama who repaired the damage that Bush did to the National Guard and to the military infrastructure during the massive deployments in Iraq. And Obama shifted to drones and special forces that you can quibble with on a policy level. You can argue that they were ineffective, that policies were incoherent, and we'll get to that on Syria in a moment. But Obama did not leave Trump a broken military. Despite the sequester charade, the Pentagon never slowed its spending, in my opinion, over the years that Obama occupied the White House. So to add another, the figure is $169 billion to the Pentagon, is just plain obscene. And this, of course, is borrowed money, just like the money borrowed to pay for the tax cuts. And these issues may come home to roost in a future economic meltdown. So the other second peg or leg of this issue is that the Democrats are relying on promises from Republicans that the DACA issue will be dealt with and that the Dreamers will not be left dangling, facing deportation as of March the 6th. And Pelosi staged that 8-hour marathon speech yesterday. Good for you, Nancy. I have no objection to that. It split her caucus. There's some conservative Dems who are worried that it's going to hurt them. But at the end of 8 hours, all Pelosi got was a lame promise from Speaker Paul Ryan that just like the Senate promise, next week there will be debate on the floor. There will be votes on immigration policy. But listen to the language of Paul Ryan. He is committed to bringing immigration legislation to the floor, something that the president will sign. Well, that means that the Dreamers are still held hostage to the fricking wall. And while nominally Pelosi's 8-hour speech yesterday was trying to reconnect the issue of immigration and the Dreamers in particular to the budget deal, Chuck Schumer sold that out 2 weeks ago when the 60-hour government shutdown was hastily called off. And as part of that disarmament, according to Truth Out, Schumer has agreed that there will be no more efforts to shut down the government. Now, of course, That was a Republican tactic that was used quite liberally, if you'll pardon that expression, by Mitch McConnell and the Republicans when Obama was president. And there will be other issues that the Democrats may or may not have leverage on, either with the public or in terms of splitting the Republican caucus. But this could be the end of any meaningful opposition to Trump and the Republicans, at least through the upcoming November midterm elections, maybe even beyond. And yesterday I mentioned that they had failed to deal with the need to raise the debt limit. And I learned last night in the details of the Schumer-McConnell budget package that they have agreed to a one-year extension of the debt ceiling through March of 2019. So this does clean up a lot of the deferred problems, all those cans that have been kicked down the road. But at what cost? And what war will be funded by this gruesome deal that was concluded on the backs of the dreamer population here in the United States? Yesterday was another bloody day in Syria, and I commend the mainstream media for breaking away from the soap opera of Trump and Mueller and Washington and actually reporting news that matters. Because essentially, there is a whole new war in Syria. Oh, some of the players have exited the stage and some new ones have entered. But the U.S. has committed itself and is in a mission creep mode. We may be there for years to come. And as long as we're there, we're part of the problem, in my humble opinion. Now, since December alone, 300,000 additional Syrians have had to be displaced. They've left their hometowns. And in one 48-hour period this week, government strikes killed more than 100 people, mostly civilians. On top of that, a Russian fighter jet was shot down by unknown rebel fighters. And the U.S. is in a new hot conflict with Turkey. The U.S. also bombed a Syrian position yesterday, which is a rare event and could produce unexpected consequences. So just as two major Syrian government assaults on rebel strongholds were intensifying, Turkey launched a surprise invasion of the Kurdish border area, and suddenly there are three regions with hot conflict underway right now. And the New York Times says it this way: the fact is, the Syrian war for years has not been just one war, but a tangle of separate but intersecting conflicts with a rotating cast of combatants. And they don't bother to go into the detail of the Saudi proxy fighters, the American proxy fighters. Nah. That's too complicated for their readers to, and of course it's not part of the American message. Anyway, they go on to say, much of the world cheered the collapse of the Islamic State's medieval-inspired caliphate last year, but that victory cleared the way for the war's underlying conflicts to resurface with a vengeance. And I do agree with that last part. And, of course, backed by Russia and Iran, the Syrian military is stepping up efforts to crush the largest remaining rebel-held pockets, and Ghouta, which was the scene of the disputed sarin attack many years ago, was the scene of alleged and reported chlorine drops over the last few days. Now, chlorine is a chemical, and it's used as a weapon, but it's not a biological weapon like sarin. And while I don't in any way rationalize the use of chlorine as a weapon in these barrel bombs and other deployments by the Syrian military, it's different from the alleged use of sarin. And the Times reports uncritically, I'll read this to you, Ghouta was the site of a 2013 attack in which sarin, a banned nerve agent, killed 1,400 people. Well, we still have serious questions about who was responsible for that, and it doesn't appear that the Syrian government was the party that may have deployed sarin in Ghouta back in 13. And the scoreboard is still ugly. An estimated 400,000 deaths, probably far more than that. 11 million Syrians displaced. That's more than half of the pre-war population. And over at the Washington Post, they use the term mission creep. Syria and Russia condemned America's military presence in Syria as illegal Thursday after an overnight confrontation in which U.S. warplanes bombed pro-Syrian government forces as they approached a U.S.-supported base. U.S. forces targeted the pro-government troops with airstrikes and artillery after they launched an attack against a base belonging to the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces in the eastern province of Deir al-Zur. The Syrian government accused the U.S. of aggression in launching the strike, said it killed scores of people. Russia denounced the U.S. presence in Syria as illegal. And because there's oil under the ground that we're fighting on right now, they suspect we have ideas. And keep in mind, Trump said during the campaign we should have taken Iraq's oil. So it's not out of line for Syrians to question whether that is our motivation now. This was the most serious clash between the U.S. and Syria since we began deploying troops in late 2015. And according to the Post, the Trump administration announced a new Syria strategy last month that envisages U.S. troops remaining in eastern Syria until there is a peace settlement to the wider war that includes a transition away from the rule of Bashar al-Assad. And with no sign of a peace deal in sight, the U.S. military is committed now to a potentially indefinite presence in Syria that is opposed by all of the region's powers. Robert Ford, the former ambassador to Syria, said the U.S. is now in mission creep mode. He continued, the Americans have managed through their diplomatic strategy to isolate themselves to the point where Turkey, Iran, and Syria all agree that what the U.S. is doing in Syria is bad. Now, Ford was part of the Obama team that bungled so badly and developed the incoherent policies in Syria that Trump is trying to build new incoherent policies on. It's a lose-lose proposition. And yet we remain, despite Trump's repeated opposition to regime change wars. That's where we are. That's what we're doing. And here are the two sides to the story. The U.S. said the conflict erupted after several hundred infantry forces backed by tanks and artillery began advancing on the Syrian Defense Force position in the town of Kisham. It's near oil fields. When the advancing forces unleashed a volley of 20 to 30 tank and artillery rounds, U.S. warplanes and artillery struck back in what's described as self-defense. The Russian Defense Ministry tells a different story. The battle occurred, they say, when a reconnaissance party made up of Syrian militias ventured across the Euphrates River to hunt down an Islamic State position, only to be attacked unprovoked by U.S. warplanes. And, of course, the corporate media in this country relies on the American military version of accounts because they don't bother, for the most part, to send reporters to cover this conflict. Remember when we used to have them embedded? That was at least better than nothing at all. My family friend Charles Glass has been covering the Middle East since the 1970s when he worked with Peter Jennings at the ABC Bureau in Beirut. And I'm linking to his latest dispatch from his own blog, entitled Another Long War Unfolds in Syria. The war in Syria should be ending. But the war refuses to die, it just takes new forms. The latest phase has little to do with Syria, apart from the fact that it's taking place there. The antagonists are Turkish President Erdogan and the United States, which has declared a post-Islamic State mission that will keep American advisors and their local surrogates in Syria for years to come. The mission calls for the U.S. to train, arm, and advise a 30,000-strong, mostly Kurdish, border security force. And as you know, that's what really tweaks Erdogan, because he regards all Kurdish militias as terrorists aligned with the PKK inside Syria. This complicates things for the United States. And as Glass points out, to pull off its plan, the U.S. must either take the PKK off of our list of terrorist groups or sell NATO allies on the idea that the group is only a terrorist organization in Turkey, but not in Syria. And, of course, the Kurdish fighters of the YPG have been the most effective stalwart forces used by the United States, and we'll use them until it gets inconvenient, and then, of course, we'll discard them like yesterday's rubbish. And Glass continues, citing the testimony of David Satterfield, State Department senior bureau official for Near Eastern Affairs. He described the U.S. plan as an effort not only to diminish Iranian foreign influence in Syria generally, but to protect our allies from the very real threat that Hezbollah poses in southwest Syria to our allies. Now, that's a reference to Israel. But Glass notes that this has never happened. He asks, how often have Hezbollah or other militias backed by the Syrians attacked Israel? Never. Since 1974. Never. And so this is another straw man argument. So I invite you to read Glass's report. I think it's pretty interesting. Also, here's the first of two citations of Australian writer Caitlin Johnstone. In a piece at Consortium News, she takes the lid off the white helmets. In fact, she blows the lid off. And she cites our friend James Corbett, the Canadian national who lives in Japan and does brilliant reporting online. And Corbett interviewed Vanessa Beeley, the independent investigative journalist who has been sharply critical of the white helmets and exposed their origins. And in a back and forth by email, Johnstone got this from Brealey. The White Helmets franchise is a terrifying extension of soft power infiltration deep inside target nations, exploiting trust, vulnerability, and poverty with the first responder construct that everyone trusts, as James Le Mesurier so clearly stated in a recent interview in Brazil. He's the leader or organizer of the White Helmets, and he's a British private security specialist and former British military intelligence officer. And Beeley goes on, this pseudo-humanitarian, NATO state-sanctioned fist will be used to crush many more nations in the future if not stopped in Syria. Just as Syria has contained the terrorist fire within its borders, so it has exposed the White Helmets as the terrorist alter ego. But for how long will both be contained? Terrorism is fanning out into Europe via the EU-funded Turkish exit routes. The White Helmets are also establishing themselves further afield in Venezuela, Malaysia, the Philippines, to name a few. Terrorism and the White Helmets march in lockstep and can only be stopped by confronting the cancerous cultures in which they are cultivated. U.S. neocolonialism, British imperialism, EU globalism, Gulf state extremism, and Israeli parasitism. Wow. I've linked to that, too. You can peruse it. Just go to peterbcollins.com. And in neighboring Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu appears to be borrowing some tactics from the Donald Trump playbook here in the U.S. Facing imminent indictment for corruption on at least 2 counts, Netanyahu is lashing out at the police and saying that his supporters need to hunker down and not listen to the referral that's going to be made, allowing a prosecutor to decide whether to pursue the cases. And Netanyahu is trying to kind of poison the jury, if you will, because one of his critics, an investigator named Al-Sheikh, said in a lengthy television interview that private detectives working on behalf of powerful people had been gathering information about investigators working on the Netanyahu cases, sniffing around their relatives and neighbors and asking questions. But referring to himself using his name and title, Netanyahu went to Facebook and excoriated Al-Sheikh for repeating the delusional and mendacious insinuation that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sent private detectives against police officers investigating him. So, Case 1000 is the accusation that Netanyahu offered favors in return for gifts of expensive cigars, pink champagne, and other goods from wealthy friends. Case 2000 involves backroom dealings with a local newspaper. And that paper, of course, is owned by Sheldon Adelson, the American. Now, I also had seen investigation on a third issue related to kickbacks or bribes from a submarine deal. But that is not referenced in today's coverage from the New York Times. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And today I went to the bank and deposited a bunch of checks that have been piling up. And so I want to give credit to recent contributors. Michael Sevilla, Tim McCarthy, who kicked in double his due, Robin Gilbert, Craig Daniels, Clifford Johnson, the ever-generous Dell Leonard, who is our vice president for marketing in the Northeast. He lives in Maine. And a big surprise yesterday when I went to the P.O. box, a big check from the maker of Kona's Kick-Ass Coffee, Russ Archibald. He's been supporting my podcast from day one. Russ, I haven't heard from you in a while. I'm very glad to get your contribution and to know that you're still listening to the podcast. Will you join them? I hope so. Just to be candid, there's turnover among my subscribers. January for years has been a big month of annual subscription renewals, and this year it wasn't so big. So it's time for you to step up, and that assumes that you've got money in the bank and that you can share it. Come on over to peterbcollins.com, click menu, click Become a Subscriber, takes you to the sign-up page, and boom, you can sign up for a PayPal monthly payment. Or if you're allergic to PayPal, and I understand that some people are, you can mail anything to me, and my mailing address is Box 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94015. Yesterday, I had to cut a couple of stories that I didn't have room for because there was so much else going on. And I want to commend The Intercept and its troubled reporter, Matthew Cole, who is part of the burn of Reality Winner. Matthew Cole, part of the burn of John Kiriakou. Matthew Cole, part of the burn of the guy who wrote the Burn Pits book, our friend from Guantanamo. But Matthew Cole wrote a story that appears to be accurate regarding the investigation of 2 Navy SEALs who were responsible for the death of a third SEAL in the African nation of Mali last June. And it gets a little complicated. The guy who died, Army Staff Sergeant Logan Melgar, was in the company of 2 of his SEAL Team 6 colleagues. And he died after being choked out by SEAL Team 6 operator Anthony DeDolph as another SEAL, Adam Matthews, watched. We don't know exactly what the motivation for this conflict was. But Melgar was pronounced dead after an investigation discovered that money that was given to the SEALs, cash money, that they could pass out to informants or people that they had killed as a death payment, some of that money was missing. And so the investigation continues into the death of Melgar. And over at Tom Dispatch today, I want to commend Nick Terse for an excellent report that puts this into context. And he says that there is $500 million that is unaccounted for in the AFRICOM division of the U.S. Department of Defense. And he goes into some detail about money that they received to conduct counter-narcotics activities in Africa. And what we find out in the process is pretty revealing, and I don't think most Americans know this. U.S. military activity since 2001 has grown at an exponential rate. U.S. troops are now conducting about 3,500 exercises, programs, and activities per year, an average of nearly 10 missions per day. Meanwhile, America's most elite troops, including Navy SEALs and Green Berets, deployed to no fewer than 33 of the 54 African countries last year. Yeah, they're out there fighting in all those shitholes that Trump doesn't want people coming to the United States from. Oh, it's crazy. Couple of great stories at The Nation today. My friend John Nichols, who was last here to promote his book, The Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse, he's been keeping track of those who enter and exit the Trump White House. And we believe that Rob Porter, the White House staff secretary, who resigned yesterday because he couldn't get a security clearance because both of his ex-wives reported that he had beaten them. And we believe that Porter is the 38th or 39th person to enter and exit the White House in the last year and 2 weeks since Trump took over. And what John Nichols points out is that Porter has been championed by John Kelly, the one-time Homeland Security Director who was moved to White House Chief of Staff and who is not subject to Senate confirmation. So getting rid of Kelly requires the president to develop some sense that he's a liability, you know, like Reince Priebus was. So I think that Nichols makes the case. I've linked to it. You can read about it from the show file at peterbcollins.com. There's also a link to this excellent report at The Nation under the byline of Stephen Cohen, the retired professor and Russia expert who's married to the publisher of The Nation, Katrina vanden Heuvel. And he does this weekly radio show with John Batchelor in New York, and then they publish a kind of summary from that. So the article's a little awkward that way, but Batchelor gives Cohen credit for coining the term Intelgate. And the article asks a bunch of really important questions about the whole Trump-Russia narrative, the Steele dossier, and related matters. And the big question that leads up to is, are we experiencing Russiagate or Intelgate? And like me, Cohen suspects that the primary driver of the whole scheme is John Brennan, and that when you look at the timelines, that it wasn't the Steele dossier exclusively, it wasn't Papadopoulos getting drunk in London with an Australian guy. It was John Brennan who initiated the first investigation into Trump and the Russians. And that appears to have started in late 2015, when he was getting or soliciting reports from foreign intelligence agencies regarding suspicious interactions between figures connected to Trump and known or suspected Russian agents. Now, that's a very important revelation. And Cohen pursues that kind of like a prosecutor, and raises a bunch of other important questions that I hope you'll take a look at when you can review the article. My second reference to Aussie powerhouse Caitlin Johnstone today is a piece she published at Steemit a couple of days ago, and it was triggered by a tweet from Rob Reiner, you know, Meathead, the Hollywood actor and producer, a darling of the Democrats. And to be fair, I've met Rob Reiner. I've worked with him on important projects here in California. But he's a really establishment Democrat guy who supported Hillary Clinton. And here's his tweet. When you libel James Clapper and John Brennan, you libel America. The desperate attack on men who have given over 90 years of dedicated service to our country is clear evidence of a conscientiousness of guilt. Now, we think he meant consciousness, but he said conscientiousness. And Caitlin Johnstone really takes him to task. She notes that virulent video starring Morgan Freeman that was produced by Rob Reiner last fall, saying that we are at war with Russia. Then she cites Jim Carrey, the Hollywood comic, who has announced that he's dumping all his Facebook stock and leaving Facebook because he believes that Facebook helped the Russians help Trump win the election. And what Johnstone concludes with, the modern liberal will squeeze every last vote out of racial identity politics that they possibly can, but try getting them to sign on to the notion of taking some actual money away from the plutocrats and the war machine and putting it toward, say, slavery reparations, and see how fast they slam the door in your face. They'll cheer for Middle Eastern immigrants but ignore the Western interventionism that creates them. They'll allow any manner of encroachment on personal sovereignty in the form of Orwellian surveillance, increasingly militarized police forces, and an increasingly corporatized prison system without so much as blinking. But don't you dare use trans-exclusionary language when talking about gender dynamics, because that would make you a Nazi. Oh, and here's our final story today. We have a new voice, fresh from retirement and exploring his creative side as an oil painter. An expert on stolen elections has surfaced to say that there's pretty clear evidence that Russia meddled in the 2016 U.S. election. And this guy knows what he's talking about. He was the guy who benefited from the election heist in Florida in 2000, and then again from the rigged election in Ohio in 2004. And he said yesterday, it's problematic that a foreign nation is involved in our election system. Our democracy is only as good as people trust the results. By now you've figured out I'm talking about George W. Bush. And here's a lousy recording of the comments he made yesterday in Abu Dhabi.
He's not, I would have said a couple of years ago, he's not a direct threat to the homeland except for the elections. And it's problematic that a foreign nation is involved in our election system, because democracy is really only as good as the people trust the results. And, there's pretty clear evidence that the Russians meddled. Whether they affected the outcome is another question. But they meddled, and that's dangerous.
So, as I say, a lousy recording. His voice sounds awful. Maybe he had a cold or something like that. I don't know how he got to Abu Dhabi without somebody trying to press a war crimes claim on him. But what is really remarkable for me is that this morning, on my Facebook feed, there were a number of people who described themselves as Democrats, as liberals, as progressives. And they were saying, hey, look, you people like Peter B. Collins and the late Bob Perry and others who don't believe that Russia meddled in our election because there's no public evidence, here's the proof. George W. Bush believes it. Well, I want to single out one person for praise. Listener, subscriber, and my Facebook friend Carla Mahoney didn't fall for it. And I'm sure many of you wouldn't either. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. It's free. You're free to share it far and wide. And you can find it on YouTube. Click that subscribe thingy when you're there.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.